So before we start on the lecture, I did want to remind you guys that your midterm is due Thursday by 11:59 p.m. in Blackboard. If for some reason Blackboard malfunctions, you can email me the exam, but try to submit it through Blackboard first. Also, tomorrow night is the Vice President candidates debate. If you watch the debate and you write something for me, like with the first debate, you can get extra credit. There's supposed to be 2 more presidential debates, but obviously that may or may not happen. So if you watch tomorrow night's debate and you submit something to me on the debate, that will count for extra credit. Okay? Any questions? No? Everyone's good? Okay. Alright, so we ended last time by talking about how education and income correlate somewhat to political participation. The more money you make, the higher your education level, the more likely you are to participate. So today we're going to break down participation in terms of race, ethnicity, gender, and religion, and then we'll discuss ways they try to get people to participate and reasons why people don't necessarily participate in the political process. Alright, so in terms of African Americans, obviously this was a group that historically could not participate in politics. And it wasn't until 55 years ago, with the passage of the Voting Rights Act, that African Americans really could vote and participate throughout the entire country. So we did see an uptick in participation because of the Voting Rights Act and the banning of a poll tax. We also will see more participation in an area that has Black representation. If an African American community is served by a Black mayor, a Black member of the House of Representatives, or a Black senator, they are more likely to vote because the leadership is reflecting the population. So states like New Jersey, Cory Booker, when he was running for Senate, there's more African American participation because they wanted an African American senator. So it helps if the representatives reflect the population, the community they're serving. And overwhelmingly, in 2008, 95% of African Americans voted for Obama. This was a huge deal to millions of Americans who hadn't been able to vote half a century earlier, who hadn't been able to run for office or marry someone outside their race. So there was a lot of peer pressure, a lot of expectation that they would go out and vote for the first Black president. And it was a really big deal. When Obama was elected, when he was giving his victory speech in Chicago, Jesse Jackson was there, and he marched with Dr. King, and he got to see the first Black president in his lifetime. So it was a really big deal. Now, while there is more participation, there are some barriers. One is poverty, right? If you can't afford to take time off of work, if you don't have transportation, that can cause some problems with being able to vote. Now, African Americans do tend to vote Democrat. There's a pretty high level of unity around supporting candidates that will discuss issues of racial discrimination, injustices, issues that are specific to the African Americans. Obviously, you can't say all African Americans are Democrats, but they do tend to support the Democratic Party in higher numbers. in terms of Latino or Hispanic Americans, we don't see as much participation. In the 2012 election, only 48% of Latino Americans voted. Part of the problem or issue is that a fair number of Latinos are recent immigrants. Obviously, you can't vote if you're not a citizen. So for some of them, they're just simply not eligible to vote. They're working towards citizenship, but they're not there yet. And obviously, if they're undocumented, they cannot participate. Latinos, Hispanics make up about 11% of the electorate, or about 27 million eligible voters. So they're not an insignificant group. They do have an impact on the outcome of an election. So the Latino vote is heavily courted by both parties. Republicans will especially focus on Cuban Americans in Florida, in and around Miami. Democrats may look at the needs of Mexican Americans in Texas or California. And the Republican Party will go after a Latino vote on social issues like abortion or same-sex marriage, because of the belief that Latinos are socially conservative because of the Catholic Church. But Latinos are tending to vote Democrat because the Democratic Party is more sympathetic on immigration issues, on creating paths to citizenship, allowing more immigrants in, helping the children of undocumented immigrants. So we do tend to see Latinos voting for Democratic candidates. Obviously, you can't say every Latino is a Democrat, but they do tend to vote Democrat. They are, again, heavily courted by both parties. You'll see campaign ads in Spanish, Facebook posts, YouTube ads, etc. Unlike their African American counterparts, they are more likely to vote in states where they are represented, where there's Latino members of Congress, mayors, state legislators. People like Julian Castro, who used to be mayor of San Antonio and then became Secretary of Housing and Urban Development under the Obama administration. That kind of leadership being reflected does increase voter turnout. It was actually in 1960 that we saw the first real attempts to port the Hispanic vote. Jackie Kennedy did it in Spanish for her husband, and it was very groundbreaking at the time. And now we'll see candidates trying to break out their Spanish on the stage. Mayor Buttigieg, in the debate with the moderator from Telemundo, speaking Spanish at a couple of points to kind of show his credentials. All right, Asian Americans are a very, very diverse, hard to pin down kind of group. There are about 21 million Americans of Asian descent. But they are less likely to vote, and some of that is tied to their background. For example, in Cambodia in the 1970s, there was a genocide, and anyone who spoke out against the government was murdered. So the children of Cambodian genocide survivors may be taught you don't speak out against the government and you don't try to participate. So some of it may be the culture of don't rock the boat, don't try to change things. And they're not a cohesive group. They're going to have different views. We have Japanese Americans, Latino Americans, Cambodian Americans, Vietnamese Americans, all with different backgrounds, all with different attitudes and views. So they're not as cohesive, not as united. Where we do see them coming together is on issues of discrimination against Asian Americans and also immigration policies. So there's some unity in those areas, otherwise they kind of do their own thing. And Asian Americans are starting to vote in higher numbers for Democratic candidates. Hillary Clinton got 65% of the Asian American vote in 2016. Again, partly tied to issues on immigration. I think I may have asked you guys this before, but do you know what the second most common foreign language in Texas is behind Spanish? Vietnamese. We have a large Vietnamese-speaking population in Texas. A lot of the people who fled the Vietnam War came to the United States and they're kind of spread out. And in Minnesota, they have a large Hmong community. The Hmongs are originally from Cambodia. So they came over in the 70s, in the 80s, and a lot of them have settled into different states. And in major cities, you often see like Chinatown and places like that that have a lot of restaurants or specialty shops, things like that. Like Little China, Little Vietnam, Little Thailand, places like that. Okay, in terms of gender, we are seeing a gender gap at play. We're tending to see that women, statistically speaking, vote in higher numbers for Democratic candidates and men for Republicans. Part of that is tied to the issues. Women, when surveyed, do tend to support gun control laws, do tend to favor keeping abortion legal. A part of it is differences in issues. But the largest gender gap we had in history was in 2016. Hillary Clinton got 54% support from women, but only 41% from men. So there was a 13% gender gap, which is the largest it's been in history. It wasn't as high as they were expecting. There was this odd expectation that women would vote for Hillary Clinton because she was a woman, which frankly is insulting, right? It's like, oh, okay, so we have to vote for her because she's a woman? Come on. And it didn't help in the primaries when Madeleine Albright was scolding women who voted for Bernie Sanders by saying there's a special place in hell for women who don't support each other. That didn't go over very well. There were a lot of women going, don't you dare tell me how to vote. They also expected that Republican women would cross party lines and vote Democrat. That didn't happen either. In terms of representation in Congress, we do have the highest number of women in Congress ever, but it's still incredibly low. 24% of the House of Representatives is made up of women, and 25% of the Senate. But women do make up a little over 50% of the population, so they are still underrepresented in Congress. So just a fun trivia question for you guys. You guys have any guesses which country might have the most women in its legislative body in the world? What country do you have the most women in its legislative body? Any guesses? Canada? Good guess, but no. Nope, not Canada. Anyone else? It's Rwanda. Rwanda is a country in East Africa about the size of Vermont, and their parliament is 64% women. Partly because of a genocide in 1994 that killed 1 million people, but also because the post-genocide government included women in the peace-building process. So they have the most women in their legislative body of country in the world. Obviously, we probably won't hit 64%, but closer to 45, 50% would be nice. Part of the reason representation is low is because women are less likely to run for office than men. Partly because of incumbency challenges, and partly because there's still somewhat of an odd traditional attitude that female candidates run into. When they're out campaigning, they might get asked, who's looking after your kids? Or is your husband okay with this? So they're still dealing with some of those issues. But there are organizations that will try to help women run for office and get money. Emily's List, which stands for Early Money is Life Yeast, it raises the dough, and the National Political Caucus will recruit candidates and help get them started in terms of fundraising. So we are seeing more women running for office. We are seeing more women winning. And there are a large number of women running for office this year. So we may see an increase in women in Congress after the election. But we still have a bit of a ways to go before we fix the imbalance. And also, up until 1993, women weren't allowed to wear pants on the floor of the U.S. Senate. Okay, in terms of religion, there is a difference in terms of people who are religious and people who aren't. Your opinions on issues like abortion and same-sex marriage can be tied to your religion or lack thereof. And it can make a difference in how you tend to vote. If you're someone who strongly believes that life begins at conception, you're probably not going to vote Democrat. If you're someone who believes that it's nobody's business but the woman's, what she does with her body, you're probably not going to vote Republican. And one of the major religious interest groups we see in politics is the moral majority. This was founded in 1979 in response to Roe v. Wade, affirmative action, women's liberation. It was founded by religious leaders Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson, and Billy Graham. And so they were trying to get evangelical Christians to the polls. And they were very successful in 1984 when 8 out of every 10 evangelical Christian vote went to Ronald Reagan. So they're pretty heavily aligned with the Republican Party. Over time, they have shifted into what is now known as the religious right, and they do continue to back Republican candidates. And they were very helpful in getting George W. Bush reelected in 2004. He made same-sex marriage a major issue on the ballot, and evangelicals showed up to support him. And so he rewarded their support by passing faith-based initiatives, abstinence-only sex education, the Global Gag Order. The Global Gag Order is an order that says any international clinic that gets funding from the U.S. cannot discuss abortion with a patient, cannot refer a patient for an abortion, cannot basically talk to women about abortion. So George W. Bush put it into place, Obama rescinded it, Trump put it back into place. So in 2016, evangelicals were supporting Ted Cruz and Ben Carson. Trump was able to get them on board when he brought Mike Pence on board, because Mike Pence is an evangelical Christian, and so he showed the community, I'm taking you seriously. And there's also an interesting relationship between where they live and how they vote. Evangelical Christians who live in a fairly secular, diverse community are more likely to be conservative and vote Republican, because they're going to feel like their values are under attack. But if they live in a pretty conservative Republican area, they're not going to feel as much push to participate, because their views are already supported by the community. Interestingly enough, this time around, the evangelical vote has fractured a bit. There are some evangelical leaders who are endorsing Joe Biden instead, because they say they may not agree with all of his policies, but he's a lifelong Catholic, he goes to Mass, he's a solidly religious man. So there's a little bit more fracturing this time around. Okay, so obviously we want people to show up to vote. So there are several tactics that are used to try and increase mobilization. And the reality is that people are more likely to vote when they're asked to do so by someone they know. So if your best friend, or your parents, or your professor who nags you into voting, guilty, tells you to vote, you may be more likely to show up. Because there's someone there to help you, right? If your parents are like, hey, let's all go vote together. Great. If I was like, field trip on election day, let's go vote. You know, I can't do that, but hypothetically, if I did, right, then the odds that you guys would vote would probably go up. So it helps if it's someone you know. So campaigns try to mimic this. For face-to-face canvassing, talking to people, not this year as much, of course, but face-to-face canvassing can increase voter turnout by about 10%. Also, the use of phone calls, if they're done well, they can increase turnout. You can't use that canned, I'm so-and-so with the Trump campaign, vote on November 3rd. You need to make it more personal. You need to say something like, well, I'm in education and I want to know what you think about this candidate's education policy. You're trying to reach out to the voters on a personal level. A little less scripted, a little bit more friendly, and you have a better chance of reaching someone. Social media also makes a difference. In 2010, Facebook posts got an additional 340,000 voters out to the polls. Not insignificant. Also, campaign volunteers, they do make a difference. In 2004, the Bush campaign had about 1.4 million volunteers helping out with voting. In 2008, Obama had a two-pronged strategy. One, he campaigned in every state, which almost no candidate does because it's expensive, it's exhausting, it's time-consuming, but he did a 50-state strategy. He also had over 700 field offices. He set up campaign offices in places that never got campaign offices. So he was really encouraging voter turnout. I strongly believe that the reason Beto almost won in 2018 is because he visited every county in Texas. He went to places that haven't seen candidates in God knows how long, right? He actually came to the valley and talked to people. That does make a difference. And again, social media. We do get most of our election news through Facebook or Twitter from our phones, right? Last week, most people found out President Trump had tested positive for COVID from their phones, Facebook, or breaking news, things like that. In fact, I think I just got a breaking news alert. Let me see. Yes, Eddie Van Halen died. Not that that's super important news, but still, right? It's people have been notified now. So it's useful because we get to find out what's happening with the president. Right now, his press secretary has COVID. The joint chiefs of staff have had to quarantine. It's basically hitting the White House really, really hard. And so we do have a right to know about that, right? We want to know if our leaders are sick, what's happening. So we're getting a lot of very important news right now. Okay, so one of the factors that also plays a role in turnout is how competitive the election actually is. For an election to be considered competitive, there has to be a very close polling. Basically, it has to be clear that this is basically a 50-50 chance that either candidate could win. So if the district is actually competitive, voters will show up. The problem is that only 24 out of 435 House races are considered competitive. The majority, either one party is always going to win, or there's not even an opposition candidate. And this is very, very problematic. In Illinois, in 2018, there was a district outside Chicago where the only Republican to run in this Democratic district was a literal Nazi. Yeah. And the Republican Party was like, for the love of God, drop out of the race. And it's like, no. And they couldn't make him because nobody ran against him. Obviously, he got his butt kicked. But it's a problem that they couldn't run a real candidate in this district. When I was in the Illinois 19th as an undergrad, the Democratic congressman was a man named Blaine Evans who was very popular. He happened to have Parkinson's disease. And so the woman who against him said two very idiotic things. First, she said people with disabilities shouldn't be allowed to serve in Congress. And then she said Congress should be able to override Supreme Court decisions. Wasn't even a close election, but that's a problem, right? They should have been able to run a valid candidate, but there was no one who was willing to do it. And so people don't show up. Either the candidate's going to win or the candidate's already lost, so why bother? We do see higher turnout in the battleground states, Florida, Iowa, Pennsylvania, New Hampshire. And the candidates pay attention to the states with the most electoral votes. California, Texas, New York, Florida. They're not going to spend much time in Wyoming or North or South Dakota. Look at the states that they think can help them get to 270. It also makes a difference when your state holds its primaries. Iowa is the first to hold the presidential caucus, followed by New Hampshire. So they have the greatest say in who the eventual nominees will be. If someone manages to win both Iowa and New Hampshire, they've got a damn good shot of being the nominee. So by the time we get dates to have a primary in May or June, usually we already know who the nominee is. So the voters in those states have no incentive to show up, right? Who cares? Well, Joe Biden's already the nominee, so why should I vote? Doesn't make a difference. We do also see higher voter turnout for ballot measures, especially if they're somewhat contentious. So in California, about $452 million were spent on recent ballot measures that included legalizing recreational marijuana, which passed, an attempt to ban the death penalty failed, although the governors basically said no executions while I'm in office, and a ban on the sale or use of plastic bags in stores, and that one actually passed. So in California, if you go to a grocery store, you either have to bring reusable bags or you have to pay for paper bags. They banned the use and sale of plastic bags in the state of California. If it's something the voters are interested in, they are more likely to show up to vote. They may not care who becomes mayor, but they might care if there's greyhound racing in their state. Florida recently banned it, Massachusetts has banned it, it's become less and less popular. If it's something the voters have strong feelings on, they're more likely to show up. Also, a somewhat controversial and yet somehow kind of funny vote in Los Angeles County. Someone put forward a measure that would require adult film actors to wear condoms in every film. The industry responded by saying, we'll leave California, and the voters said no to that proposition. So if it's somewhat contentious, people will show up to vote. It also doesn't help that voter registration is tricky, right? You have to register to vote before you can vote. There's really no getting around it. And so it makes it harder on people who constantly have to move. Students, military, people who have to move every year because of their job. It can be really difficult to re-register to vote, to meet that deadline. A handful of states, California, Oregon, Connecticut, Vermont, and West Virginia, have passed laws where you are automatically registered to vote once you can prove residency. So basically, once you've established residency, like setting up utilities or something like that, they automatically register you to vote. Does make it easier, right? You move to that state and you don't have to fill out a form. It's a lot less complicated. They also will automatically register high school seniors to vote. So if they're going to be 18 before election day, they don't have to register. The state will do it for them. Part of the problem with turnout, though, is the requirement to have a photo ID. 32 states require you to show some form of ID, but that can be something like a utility bill, your social security card, student loan statement, something like that. 7 require you to have a photo ID, and 9 want photo ID but may make alternate arrangements. The problem with this is some states are so strict on what type of photo ID you can have. You may need to have a driver's license or state ID card, but that can be hard to get if you're elderly or poor, or your nearest public safety department is 15 miles away and you don't have a car, right? Some states, a photo ID could be something like your student ID card or something else, but in a handful of states it has to be a driver's license or state ID, which does unfortunately have the effect of decreasing turnout for racial minorities, poor people, and the elderly. There's also the fact that felons lose the right to vote. In 29 states, once a felon has completed their probation or parole period, they can get the right to vote back. But 9 states require a felon to get their voting rights back through the governor or the courts, which means you have to spend time, you have to spend money, you have to get the right forms. It becomes a bit tricky. So because of these laws, 5.3 million people have lost the right to vote, and essentially 1 in 8 black men in the United States cannot vote because of felony convictions, mostly tied to things like drug offenses. Now, Florida did pass a law in 2018 that would give felons the right to vote back automatically once they completed their parole/probationary period. Then the governor said that you have to pay off any money you owe before you can get the right to vote back. So some organizations have stepped in to pay off the fine so they can vote. Michael Bloomberg has been paying the fines for felons, and now they're getting questions about, well, is this an attempt to buy a vote? And it's like, hang on a minute, you can't have it both ways. You can't say you pay it off, but then when someone does turn around and say, now you can't. Right? Make up your mind, one way or the other. And it also doesn't help that election day is on a Tuesday. Right? We have school, we have work, we have responsibilities. So it would probably help if we moved the election to a weekend, or if we made election day a national holiday. Shut down the school, down most businesses, give people the day off of work. Okay, so in terms of voting, 11 states plus the District of Columbia actually allow you to register and vote on election day. So if you just moved to that state and you go in and you say, I moved here 3 days ago, I'm not registered to vote, you can fill out a voter registration form, they can verify it, you can vote. Which honestly would make it a lot easier for people who move all the time to be able to vote. If you know you cannot vote on election day because you are ill, disabled, constantly traveling, you know you're not going to be in your home district, you can ask for an absentee ballot to be sent to you every single election. Also, this year, a lot of states have opted to give people the right to do a mail-in ballot because of COVID. Oregon mostly votes by mail. In other states, you have to request an absentee ballot, you have to meet the criteria, and then you can have one sent to you. You can also early vote. In most states, it's 2 to 3 weeks before the election that you can vote anywhere in your county. It gives people the chance to vote on a weekend, or like in 2018 when we had a polling place on campus, it made it easier to early vote that year. So voters who know they're not going to be able to vote on election day for whatever reason. But the states sometimes get funky. The governor of this state last week issued an order saying that he would limit drop-off places for ballots to one location per county. He's gotten a lot of flack for that because Harris County has about 5 million people. How can you only have one drop-off location per county with that many people? It's a little problematic. And in Florida, where they can never get an election right to save their life, in 2012, the state legislature, in their infinite wisdom, decided they would reduce the number of early voting days from 14 to 8 and got rid of some of the weekend polling places. It was seen as an attempt to limit African American and Democratic voters out, but it didn't quite work out. In Florida, there are 2 counties that can have an impact on the outcome of the election: Miami-Dade and Broward counties. For South Florida, they include Miami, Hialeah, Fort Lauderdale. And so what happened was on election day, the voters got ticked off, showed up to vote, and they couldn't call Florida until late at night, because it took forever to count the votes. And Obama ended up winning Florida anyway, and they restored the voting days. And Florida looked, well, bad as usual. I was getting text messages from friends that night going, "What's going on in Florida?" I'm like, "It's Florida. The election never was right. Just hang on, they'll figure it out eventually." Also, Miami-Dade and Broward counties have large numbers of minority voters, especially African Americans. So, yeah. It's partly why Florida is a swing state, because these are very heavily populated counties. All right, so in terms of participation today, the reality is that participation has an effect on policy. So the affluent, the well-educated, and older Americans have more of a voice in politics. We see more concerns over Social Security and Medicare, wealth taxes, tax cuts, right? Because they show up to vote consistently. So they're the ones that politicians pay the most attention to. One thing that could help participation would be to create a permanent voter registration. That once you register to vote, that's it. That if you move states, you don't have to re-register, you just have to bring proof of residency on election day. That would probably be very helpful. If you're someone who constantly moves and you didn't have to re-register, that would help. Also, if we automatically registered people to vote as soon as they turn 18, and made a very, very, very concentrated attempt to get high school seniors registered to vote. That could help as well. Your first election is confusing no matter what. You got to figure out how to register to vote, where to vote, how you want to vote. If we took some of the confusion out of it, that might help young people. Also, we have got to get rid of gerrymandering. We've got to stop letting the state legislatures draw up the districts, because they create them in ways that are so blatantly unfair. California and Iowa have switched to using a nonpartisan board that draws it up based on geography, and their elections are competitive and fair. So we need to stop letting the state legislature and the majority party decide the election districts. Make it a nonpartisan, independent board who draws it up based on population and actually makes the elections competitive. It's time to start making this a partisan nightmare. We need to stop giving the parties all of the power over who's allowed to vote where. It's obscene that that still happens. We are seeing more use of digital and social media. Ads on YouTube, Facebook pages, Instagram, Snapchat, and more knowledge. It's hard not to know anything about the candidate, especially on the national level. We all have some pretty basic knowledge, at least, of what Biden and Trump are running on, what they stand for, their issues. So we are more informed than we've ever been. And that can increase participation, because the more you know, the more likely you are to participate. So this is actually kind of a good thing. It can be bad when social media is misused, but if it's actually used the way it's supposed to use, this can be a very good thing. President Trump actually got into trouble with Facebook and Twitter, so he tweeted out something saying, COVID's not as bad as everybody says it is, I'm doing fine, it's not a big deal, and so Twitter said no, and basically put a block on it and said, this post contains misleading information, click here if you still want to see it. As they're not going to allow people to post false information about COVID. I'm glad he doesn't have a bad case of it, I'm glad he's feeling better, but don't say that it's not a big deal. That's really not the message we need to be hearing right now. But there is at least some attempt this time around to crack down on false information. It's still going to seep through anyway, you can't catch everything, but at least they're making a good faith effort to crack down on it this time around. Alright, so since we have a little time, out of curiosity, how many of you are registered to vote? Okay, and how many of you are planning to vote? Oh, better than my morning class. That's good. Okay. There's no right or wrong answer, but why do you think it is that people don't vote? Why is it that we see such low numbers of people actually participating? Sure. Sure. 2015, two most disliked candidates in modern history. That doesn't help. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. If we don't like the candidates, some people just aren't going to force themselves to vote. Yeah, definitely. Sure. Yeah. My vote's not going to make a difference. It's one of a couple 100 million. Who cares? Yep. That definitely does play a role. Yeah. How many of you would vote somewhat regularly if election day was a holiday, if you didn't have to go to work or school? Yeah, okay, okay. Yeah, I mean, I think that makes a difference too. Not everyone's boss is nice enough to be like, oh, you're in line for 2 hours to vote. Yeah, that's fine, right? They're going to be like, get back to work. They're not going to be as sympathetic. In 2016, I had to wait in line to vote over an hour, and my boss was like, that's fine, no problem, but not everyone gets that lucky, right? Not everyone gets that boss. It's like, yeah, it's okay if you wait. Also, people may not want to wait for 4 hours to vote, which does sometimes happen, right? Some people will look at that and be like, not worth it, and just walk away. Yeah, it can be a problem. Actually, finding the time on election day can be a little tricky. If we did actually have elections that were competitive, where every House seat was potentially up for grabs, do you think people might vote if they knew their vote might actually make a difference in the outcome of the election? Possibly, yeah. Yeah, so I've lived in states where like, well, my vote doesn't matter, so, you know, I mean, I'll vote however I want, right? Where I'm like, I'll vote third party, because I don't like either one of you idiots, and I know which one of you is going to win, so fine. Yeah, maybe if it did make a difference, maybe. What is the baseline? That is an excellent question. Because the barriers for, okay. Part of it is because the two parties don't want that third party candidate on the stage. They don't want them to be seen as a threat. The only time we've had a third party candidate on the stage was '92 when Ross Perot, because he was a billionaire, actually had enough money and pulling to get on the stage. And both President George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton hated that he was there. Hated it. So the two parties don't like it because they don't want people voting for a third party candidate. Another problem is the system is set up in a way where it's next to impossible for a third party candidate to get onto the debate stage. I've been pulling at, I think, at least 5% in most states, and most of them don't get anywhere near 5%. But largely it's just the two parties saying, we don't want a spoiler, so stay off of our stage. And it's unfortunate because I think if the Americans were looking at the candidates and going, you guys suck, I really want to hear from these guys, that would be beneficial. If we actually had the libertarian and green candidates on the stage as well, that could actually open the door for a third party victory. But basically, because the two parties don't want them there, don't want the voters to be reminded they actually have another choice. They just see them as spoilers. So I thought you're just going to take votes away from us. Get off the stage. And there is some validity to that. There's a reason why George H.W. Bush lost in '92 is because the Republican vote fractured between him and Ross Perot. But then the comeback to that is, well, that's your problem, right? You should have run a better campaign. Honestly, I think the third party candidates need to be on the stage, they need to be included, and they need to be a viable alternative to the two party system, because it sucks. It just sucks. Yeah. I really wish we would stop this two-party nonsense and actually open the doors and be like, all right, Green Party, Libertarian, Social Democrats, Tea Party, all y'all are welcome. Let's do this. If we actually had a multi-party system, maybe we'd actually get people to work together instead of, you know, this bullshit that we see. I mean, because I've seen this happen, right? I lived in Illinois, land of corrupt governors and corrupt politics. They actually had two governors in a row go to jail. That was fun. And in 2006, there was a governor's race between Rod Blagojevich, Democratic incumbent, and a woman named Judy Bartopinga. And basically, they spent all of their time mudslinging, name-calling, insults, nothing but ugliness. But there was a third-party candidate, a Green candidate, who was talking about education, student loans, health care. And I was like, no, I want that guy to be governor, because he's actually talking about the issues. And he did fairly well for a third-party candidate, but Blagojevich got reelected. Then Obama became president, and Blagojevich was caught on record trying to sell Obama Senate seat and ended up in federal jail. So that worked out pretty well for the people of Illinois. But it's frustrating, right? When you see these two candidates and you're like, neither one of you is really what we need in office. You both suck. You please just both shut up and get out of our ways. It's unfortunate because obviously if the third party candidate had won, we wouldn't have had two governors in a row going to jail. That might have helped. All right, any other questions, thoughts? Okay, so again, the exam is due this Thursday by 11:59 p.m. in Blackboard. If it's a little late, that's fine. I'm not going to be too crazy if you turn it in at like 12:30 or something. But if it's more than a day late, I'll start giving you penalties unless there's a valid reason why it's late. So the Dropbox is open in Blackboard. If for some reason it's not working, let me know. Otherwise, just make sure I have your exam Thursday night. Any last questions on the exam? Okay. So Thursday we're going to start on chapter 9. So make sure you read the first half of chapter 9. And I'll see you guys online on Thursday. Enjoy the rest of your day.